Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to address this post-Keynesian audience. So when I was asked to present something on globalization and the dynamics of capitalism diversity, I said, yeah, no problems. And then a short while ago, I realized, well, that's a bit of a big topic, isn't it? So I was sort of worried about what I could say. And then I decided to focus more narrowly my talk. So I won't be talking about capitalism diversity in general, but I'll focus on specific aspects of diversity related to some specific aspects of globalization. And I won't be talking about the world economy, but only on developed countries, which is more my area of specialization, and more specifically about European countries, I suppose. So let me first give you a broad overview of what capitalism diversity is according to my view of that topic. The idea is, if you look at most analysis of comparative capitalism, especially when it comes to developed countries, you will see that comparative capitalism is very much about emphasizing the differences with respect to institutions of the different socio-economic models. But in my opinion, comparative capitalism is not simply making a list of the institutional specificities, like, you know, the financial system in the United States being different from the financial system in Germany, and trying to see what the implications of that would be for the rate of investment or something like that. So in order to be more general in the apprehension of the problem, I would say that you need to take four elements into consideration if you want to make comparative capitalism something which is truly a political economy question. The first is, of course, what we could call the socio-economic model, like the institutions which characterize the different models of capitalism. And as you know, as I've said, most of comparative capitalism literature is focused on that. And usually the theory behind that is to say that those institutions are not a random collection of institutions, but they're linked to one another by complementarities, and the fact that these institutions complement with respect to some sort of global coherence of the system. The other three elements are what my usual co-author, Stefano Palombarini, and I have called dominant social blocks, which is the idea is that institutions are socio-political compromises and are not simply, you know, techniques to organize the economy, and they need to be supported by a social alliance or a socio-political alliance. So the dominant social bloc would be the dominant socio-political alliance which would support the dominant political strategy, and of course the institutions of the socio-economic model. The third aspect would be the political actors, because the dominant social bloc is not some sort of natural given, but it's something which is organized by political actors, by a certain political strategy. So the political strategy would be implemented by some specific political coalition, which would implement some specific structural institutional change and some specific economic policy. And the fourth element is more typically economic in a way. It's the economic policy, and specifically the macroeconomic policy, which of course supports those the other three elements. Without going into all the literature on capitalism diversity, you will find many typologies of countries in the literature. Probably the most well-known one is the so-called varieties of capitalism approach, which was developed by Peter Hall and David Soskis, which is a bit out of fashion nowadays, to be honest, but which still is dominant in the political economy literature, and which is famous for its difference between so-called coordinated market economies, CMEs, and liberal market economies, LMEs. And of course, this typology has been very critical, very much criticized in literature for being too rigid, too unidimensional, and all that. You find many other approaches, which I'm not going to expand for lack of time, really. I mean, I've published myself a book quite a while ago, actually, proposing a different classification. But the problem is not the classification, really. It's not whether you've got 2 or 3 or dozen types, different types of capitalism. What matters is the theory which underlies the classification, and what should be the elements we want to take into consideration when we want to tackle the issue of capitalism diversity. Regarding globalization, so what has globalization anything to do with the diversity of capitalism or the variety of capitalism? Again, let me mention briefly the mainstream views. So the mainstream economic view, which I suppose you're familiar with, is the fact that basically there is a one best way of doing things, which is usually associated with, the liberalized, financialized type of capitalism, which is, the type of policy and structural recommendations which are made by mainstream economics. And the link with globalization is pretty simple, really. It says that globalization is strengthening competition between systems, and this competitive pressure is going to bring systems, firms, countries, industries towards the one best way, which is, liberalized capitalism, what the variety of capitalism approach would call a liberalized market economy. Another mainstream view, but not in mainstream economics, but in political economy, is precisely the variety of capitalism view, which says basically something which is not very different from the mainstream economic view, really, saying that, yes, globalization is a competitive pressure, and this is going to lead countries towards a one best way in a way, except the one best way is not unique. If you remember, I said that variety of capitalism is differentiating coordinated market economies from liberal market economies. And they say that it is not going to be the convergence towards a unique model of capitalism, but it is going to be what they call the bifurcated convergence. So that coordinated market economies are going to be more coordinated, because they're competitive by being coordinated. So increasing the competitive pressure is going to lead them to be more coordinated. And the LMEs are going to be more deregulated, more liberalized, because, well, they're competitive by being liberalized, so increasing the competitive pressure is going to lead to more liberalization. And in fact, there is another aspect which is mentioned by the variety of capitalism approach, which is to say that globalization is going to lead coordinated market economies to become more coordinated, which is going to bring more social cohesion, whereas the liberal market economies are going to be more liberalized, and this means that social conflict should intensify. My own view, and the view of other more critical political economists on the topic, is to consider not globalization as simply a competitive pressure, but also a source of increasing tensions which are going to have consequences for the domestic socio-political equilibrium, as I was mentioning before. So you've got many tensions, of course, associated with globalization. The first that you can imagine is that globalization, by increasing the competitive pressure, is going to push for more productive specialization, and at the same time is going to push, and I'm going to mention that in a minute, to more institutional uniformity in a certain number of domains. And of course, there is a contradiction between that, if you believe that there is something to the idea that there exists in a certain way, a competitive institutional advantage. So if some countries are competitive in some productive activities precisely because they have got specific institutions which enable them to be competitive, then pushing for institutional uniformity is something which is detrimental to the competitive institutional advantage. This is similar to what the variety of capitalism school is saying, but they're saying that the competitive pressure is going to push coordinated economies into being more coordinated. Whereas you could consider that, in fact, globalization is going to push for institutional uniformity, even for coordinated market economies. So that coordinated market economies, by being more liberalized, if you want to stick to this dichotomy between CMEs and LMEs, by being more liberalized, CMEs are going to be less competitive on world markets. Another source of increasing tensions is, of course, increasing inequalities and the diminished possibilities for inequality reducing policies. This is linked to the previous point, really, saying that if you've got an increase in specialization, then it is going to lead to more inequalities one way or another, whether inequalities between regions or inequalities between different skill levels, etc. And at the same time, institutional uniformity pressures is going to diminish the possibilities, for instance, for the welfare state to diminish those inequalities. So this is bound to generate tensions at the same time. And you could sum up all these aspects by saying that globalization is going to be instrumental in initiating a change of socio-economic model. And if you take a longer view, like between the post-war years to the current period, and the transition between what was called the Fordist compromise, between an increase in productivity being shared across capital and labour in a more or less stable way. From this Fordist compromise to a more neoliberal regime, which is characterised by increasing inequalities, blah, blah, blah. I mean, all the things you're probably familiar with. There is an image, a simplification in a way, but which I like very much, which is the Fordist period had been described as being a compromise between a fraction of capital and the employees and labour. And you could say that the neoliberal regime is more like an alliance between capital and a fraction of labour. And what I want to say is that globalization is going to be instrumental in allowing this reversal of alliances between capital and some fractions of labour. I'm, for lack of time and to spare the audience, I'm not going to review all the changes that globalization has led to regarding all the elements which are mentioned on this slide. Like, I suppose you're mostly familiar with this idea that globalization has favored financial liberalization by allowing the so-called freedom of capital movements, by permitting tax evasion, which undermined institutions like the welfare state, which undermined fiscal policy, etc. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Globalization and some regional aspects of globalization, for instance, within the European Union, has meant increased so-called product market competition, which is not increased competition in a way, which is more like liberalization of markets, which lead to private oligopolies replacing public monopolies, and the end of the public services or public utilities in favor of private oligopolies. Globalization has favored labor market liberalization by, increasing the pressure for firms to push for lower employment protection legislation, for favoring the development of precarious employment, and so on and so forth. Globalization has also favored welfare state retrenchment by, increasing precisely the pressure on production costs, which means that, again, firms would push for a lowering of the general coverage of all sorts of risks and lowering the generosity of benefits, etc., etc. So I could have produced statistics on every of those points to convince you that that was the case, but I suppose that I don't need to do that. Again, if you come back to the political economy of competitive capitalism, I mentioned institutional complementarities previously, and the thing is that all those elements are, of course, taking place separately, but they're also producing effects jointly, which means that liberalization in any one of those items, like financial liberalization, product market competition, and so on and so forth, is going to lead to consequences which will actually drive the system towards more liberalization. This is quite complicated matrix of all the influences that some structural reforms in the various areas, like, for instance, labour market, product market, social protection, and so on, are going to have for other aspects of the socio-economic model. Like labour market deregulation is going to have an impact on product market competition, is going to have an impact on social protection and so on. Like, I mean, it's well known that, for instance, that the development of financial system financial systems deregulation in itself is going to have a consequence for welfare state retrenchment, for instance, etc. So you could say that there is a sort of a systematic association between some structural reforms which are either favoured or pushed by globalization and the way they're going to lead to a further dismantling of some of the socio-economic models which are as far as possible from the liberal market economies. But I'm not going to just want to mention that briefly to say that there is a system aspect in this in these changes, which means that some changes are going to lead to more changes, which are going to lead themselves to even more changes, and there is a sort of a logic in this. But I don't want to convey the idea that this is an automatic process, because it's not an automatic process at all. Again, institutions in a political economic perspective are political compromises, socio-political compromises, and they depend mostly on national socio-political conditions. So which means that we should not consider globalization as some sort of a natural force which would apply to the systems like, change in climate or something, but more like something which is some forces, some global or international forces interacting with domestic elements. I take the example of the welfare state retrenchment, for instance. If you see the literature on welfare state retrenchment, you've got an economic literature which focuses on the role of economic changes, like, for instance, trade openness is going to lead to pressures for welfare state retrenchment and so on. I mean, Roderick has written extensively on that, for instance. You've got a political science literature, or a political economics literature, which is focusing on the impact of different political institutions or partisanship, political equilibriums, on welfare state retrenchment. In a rather old article published about a dozen years ago, what we showed, my co-author and I, was that actually you could model the welfare state retrenchment as an interaction between those elements, really, saying that what we showed was that the partisanship of the government in interaction with the economic evolution would lead to welfare state retrenchment or not welfare state retrenchment. So meaning that it's not globalization per se or economic evolution following globalization per se, which is responsible for welfare state retrenchment. It is always in interaction with some domestic politics and some the strategies of domestic political actors which take opportunity to orient institutional change in one direction or another. And in fact, what I would want to show you is that globalization in itself is not directly impacting the system, the socio-economic models, but is changing the possibilities for national actors to actually change the systems. Even before, when I started to think about this presentation, I wanted to talk about the importance of fiscal competition. And this had nothing to do with the Paradise Papers, which were published earlier this week, but it makes a nice background. So I took an old paper of mine, which was never published actually, which I wrote with Dr. Lagatti a while ago, 12 years ago, on precisely our idea was to model the impact of one aspect of internationalization, which was fiscal competition. So it's a theoretical model, but let me just tell you the story that the theoretical model is telling. We modeled 3 different social groups, which is capital, to put it simply, capital and 2 groups of workers. And you would have labor market segmentation. So one worker group would be protected by legislation, and the other would not be protected. So it would be like, a primary sector as a secondary sector. And one worker group would be a net benefactor from taxation redistribution, and the other group could be benefactor of the taxation redistribution, depending on some circumstances. And they would have to decide on 2 institutions, which would represent the socio-economic model, and that would be the level of employment protection legislation and the level of redistribution/taxation. And of course, those 3 groups would have conflicting preferences over the institutional configuration. You would have a capital labor conflict over taxation and redistribution, plus a possible intra-labor conflict on the same issue. And you would have an intra-labor conflict as well as a capital-labor conflict over the extent of employment protection legislation. So the point being that in order to come to an agreement, a political agreement on a socio-economic model characterized by employment protection legislation and redistribution, you would have to build a political compromise between the different actors. And the point is that this compromise would be influenced by actually the extent to which capital would have the possibility to evade taxation. So the idea was that by evading taxation, actually capital would push the burden of taxation on one worker group, and this worker group would be less and less prone to actually have a high level of taxation, which is going to have, of course, an impact on redistribution, which means an impact on the protected group, the dominant group of labor, as well as an impact on the dominated group of labor, the secondary labor group. So increasing tax evasion would, in fact, not only would actually diminish the bargaining position of labor as a whole, but also intensify the conflict between primary sector and the secondary sector of labor, precisely over this issue of redistribution. And regarding the possible coalitions between the different groups with this model, you would see that increased internationalization would affect, in fact, the coalition formation process, as well as affect the type of policy and institutions which would be decided by those coalitions. So in a nutshell, increased internationalization, meaning more possibilities for tax evasion for capital, would modify the political coalition domestically and lead to an equilibrium where you would have less employment protection and less redistribution. So in a nutshell, a more liberalized model of capitalism. And this, in fact, means that increased internationalization would lead to would be equivalent, formally equivalent to an increased bargaining position of capital. The second thing I wanted to mention to you is this idea of growth models, which my colleagues at the University of Geneva were so much interested in, are still so much interested in. This idea that they would want, basically they want to link the idea of political economy of competitive capitalism with more macroeconomic considerations, and particularly post-Keynesian macroeconomic considerations. And they question, for instance, the compatibility of different growth models within Europe, like, for instance, an export-led growth model characterizing, for instance, Germany, and a more consumption-led growth model characterizing Italy or more southern European countries, and question, of course, the stability of those different models. So what I did was actually take a typical post-Keynesian Kaleckian model and try to modify it slightly and see what we could do with that. So I took a model which you're probably very familiar with, which you can find in Blecker's paper, adding public sector, which you can find, for instance, in the Franke's paper. So you would have, saving investment function, public expenditure, foreign trade, net foreign assets, an explanation of inflation with conflicting claims modeling, and the macroeconomic equilibrium, which is like typical of the post-Keynesian model. So I suppose you're very familiar with this type of model. And what it gives, very shortly, so it's very much like Blecker's model, if you're familiar with this model. In the short term, you can have a profit-led or a wage-led regime. So you would have the rate of utilization of capacity, which would be positively or negatively linked with an omega. Omega is the real wage rate. You would have, in the medium run, an equilibrium between the real wage rate, or, if you wish, the share of wages in GDP, and the real exchange rate, and it would be a stable equilibrium. Again, this is not very different from Blecker's model. This is just an extended Blecker's model. in the long run, what takes place in the long run is an equilibrium in terms of public debt and net foreign assets. And this is where the results are a bit more original. You've got different configurations which are possible as far as I could investigate. So you could have, on the right-hand side, you would have this nice locally stable equilibrium with, so D is public debt and F is net foreign assets. You would have an equilibrium which would be locally stable at least. But you could have other possibilities depending, of course, on the characteristics of the economy. And you would have mostly, as you can see, saddle point instability or saddle point stability, depending on which way you want to look at it. So you could have the possibility of economies actually reaching an equilibrium or actually not reaching an equilibrium, and a growth of imbalances where, for instance, net foreign assets would diminish, or and public debt would augment, or the reverse. Net foreign assets could increase and public debt could diminish, depending on what initial conditions the economy finds itself in. So the long-term dynamics is actually something which is interesting. You've got the possibility of unstable trajectory, which of course question the possibility of a compatibility between export-led countries and demand-led countries between the EU, like for instance Germany versus the rest of Europe, for instance, and also a limited exercise would be to let's look at the impact of some structural reforms, which would be, for instance, imposed by this or the other circumstance regarding globalization. And the idea was to see what would happen if you've got a drop in a decrease in public expenditures. So you would have a short-term effect, which is well known, which would be decreasing the level of economic activity. You would have, as the model is specified, no impact on income shares or the real exchange rate in the absence of some sort of Phillips curve effect in the determination of wages. And in the long-run impact, the D dot equals 0 locus would move downwards, which if you look at that, which would be okay if you consider the stable dynamics configuration, because it would lead to more net foreign assets and less public debt. So you could suppose that this would be the bet made by Germany by having this Schwarze Null type of policy, which would lead to decrease in debt and increase in net foreign assets, which would, in the long run, lead to an increase in the rate of capacity utilization. But if you consider the saddle point dynamics configurations, a drop in public expenditures could actually destabilize the system, provided it was stable in the first place, and then lead the economy to, as I've mentioned before, one of those unstable trajectories, whereas you would have, for instance, an increase, and Germany could be in that situation, an increase in net foreign assets, an increase in the current account, and a decrease in public debt, but of course at the expense of the other countries. So that would be, again, a general instability within the EU and general incompatibility of the different growth models within the EU. So to conclude briefly, what is the impact of globalization on the diversity of capitalism? It's neither the convergence to a supposedly optimal and unique or binary configuration of capitalism, nor the reinforcement of the specificities of idealized varieties, as in the variety of capitalism. You've got common trends towards liberalization imposed by or facilitated by globalization, which further lead to further neoliberal institutional change because of the institutional complementarities which I've mentioned. Well, I think the most important element is to take into account that those globalization is actually enabling a destabilization of the past socio-political compromises which were supporting the socio-economic models. And in fact, actors which want a change of model for one or the other reason could use the forces of globalization or the possibilities offered by globalization to precisely destabilize this previous socio-political equilibrium in order to establish a new regime for the socio-economic model. And this is the last point I would want to finish with, which is to say that, for instance, what we see as or what we could see as some sort of unfortunate side effect of globalization, like, for instance, increasing inequality or increasing labor market segmentation, etc., are in fact not unfortunate side events. They're actually necessary precisely to break the old socio-political equilibriums and to permit the emergence of a new regime which would be more neoliberal. So actually, the problem for the actors which want this type of transition to a new neoliberal regime to take place is not to limit inequalities or to limit segmentation, but it's actually to increase inequalities and to increase segmentation, because those two elements are, as I've said, structural prerequisites for the transition to a new regime. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.